The snow hadn't stopped in 3 days, and Helen was sure nothing living could survive the storm. But when she opened her front door that morning, she found a tiger, bleeding, exhausted, and holding something in its mouth. Not a threat, a canvas bag, inside it, a military badge, and etched on its back the name of her son, Daniel, the same son they buried 5 years ago. What this tiger knew, what it had carried through fire and blizzards, wasn't just survival, it was truth, and someone out there would do anything to silence it. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Cold Creek, Montana. Had not seen this kind of snowstorm in over a decade. The sky had been bruised gray for days, and the wind rolled down from the Bitterroot Mountains with a cruel, scraping sound, like claws on glass. Flakes fell thick and fast, piling up on rooftops and muffling every sound beneath a heavy white silence. Out on the edge of town, past the frozen creek and into the outer woods, stood a quiet wooden house, simple, sturdy, and weather-worn inside. Helen McCarthy, a 61-year-old woman with tall, lean features and a tired elegance, stood at the kitchen sink holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled into a low knot. She wore thick wool socks and an oversized olive-green sweater that had once belonged to her late husband. Helen had lived alone here for the last 6 years, ever since her only son, Daniel, had been reported missing during a wildfire rescue operation. They never recovered his body, only ashes, only silence. The storm was still roaring when she first noticed it. A shadow, then stillness. Something was lying on the snow-covered porch just beyond the front steps. Helen blinked twice before reaching for the old binoculars near the windowsill. Her hands, still steady after years of battlefield medicine, adjusted the focus. Her breath caught. It was a tiger, not a hallucination, not a trick of the light, an actual tiger, massive, striped, and filthy, sprawled across the snow like a fallen statue. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding. Tigers didn't belong here, not in Montana, not in the wild. Her mind tried to reason. Escaped from a traveling zoo from a private collector, but there had been no reports. She reached for the phone, then stopped. Something about the way the tiger lay, its shoulders hunched, fur soaked and tangled, sides heaving with slow, shallow breaths, made her pause. It looked defeated. Helen pulled on her heavy coat and snow boots, against all logic. She stepped out into the storm. The cold slapped her cheeks instantly, and the wind tugged at her sleeves, but she pressed forward, down the front steps and into the waist-high snow, stopping just short of the tiger's reach. He didn't move. His amber eyes, dulled with exhaustion, met hers without fear or aggression. They simply stared. She studied him, mud-crusted paws, ribs faintly visible, a matted coat flecked with frost and ash. His ears twitched, but there was no growl, no snarl, no tension in his limbs. He was starving. Helen retreated without a word and returned minutes later, her arms cradling a shallow metal bowl filled with warm broth, cooked rice, and the shredded remains of a leftover roast. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She set the bowl at the edge of the porch and stepped back. The tiger slowly raised his head. Snow clung to his whiskers. After a few seconds, he pushed himself up with great effort and limped to the bowl, eating slowly, almost reverently, as though he understood this was an offering, not a trap. Helen watched, her breath fogging the air in front of her. She didn't speak, didn't approach, just observed, as any good nurse or mother would when he finished. The tiger looked at her again, and then, without a sound, he turned and padded back toward the tree line, disappearing into the white. That night, Helen barely slept. She sat in the dim light of her living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall. There was something in the tiger's eyes she couldn't forget, something wounded, not just physically, but deeper. She didn't know if he would return, but he did. The next morning, with the storm finally calmed and a muted sun rising behind the clouds, Helen opened her front door and gasped. The tiger was back, sitting squarely at the base of her steps. He looked a little stronger. His fur had dried, though patches were still thick with dirt and burrs. His eyes were clearer, alert, and between his massive front paws was a tattered canvas backpack. Helen's heart jumped. She stepped forward, boots crunching softly on the hardened snow. The tiger did not move. He watched her, silently, trustingly. The backpack was old, faded from sun and weather. She crouched and gently opened the main flap. Inside was a patch, frayed and dirty, but still intact. U.S. Wildlife Response Unit, Division 6 decommissioned, shut down after a fatal wildfire in Yellowstone 5 years ago. Helen's fingers trembled as she reached deeper. Sewn into the interior pocket was a name tag, D. McCarthy, Daniel. Her knees gave out, and she sat on the snow without feeling the cold. Her eyes stung, but no tears fell. Yet, she looked up at the tiger. He hadn't brought violence. He had brought her a message, the morning after Ronan returned with the backpack. The air had shifted, the storm had passed, leaving the town of Cold Creek blanketed in an almost holy stillness. Light filtered through the pine branches, refracting against icicles like stained glass in a silent cathedral. Helen McCarthy sat at her kitchen table, staring at the badge with her son's name embroidered inside the torn canvas. A mug of untouched tea steamed quietly beside her, but she barely noticed. The tiger. No. Ronan, she had started calling him that, was lying outside near the woodshed, eyes half closed, tail flicking slowly in the snow. He didn't act like a wild animal. Not exactly. There was something structured about his presence, as if he had learned to live with humans once, long ago, and never fully forgot how. That was when the front door creaked open and a small, hesitant voice called out. Grandma Helen stood quickly, startled. Jade. Through the doorway stepped a thin girl, about 9 years old, wrapped tightly in a red wool coat that hung slightly oversized on her frame. She had pale skin that flushed easily in the cold, and long brown hair that tangled over her shoulders. Jade, her granddaughter, had arrived from Boise a day earlier than expected, brought by a neighbor while her mother was admitted to a care facility. Helen hadn't yet explained the tiger. I heard something outside last night, Jade murmured, like growling. Helen crouched to meet her granddaughter's wide gray eyes. He's not dangerous, she said gently. He's different. They walked to the window together. Outside. Ronan lifted his head at the movement. Jade pressed her hand against the cold glass and stared. It's a real tiger. He came here hurt, cold. I gave him food. Now he's just here. Jade didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on Ronan, not with fear, but fascination, that afternoon. She sat by the front door with her notebook open, sketching quietly. She never asked to pet him. She just observed. Her pencil moved in gentle curves, tracing the heaviness in his posture, the way his eyes seemed older than the world. Helen didn't interrupt. She returned to the backpack. Inside, behind the badge, she found a flap stitched along the inner lining, sealed with Velcro. When she pried it open, Something small and hard slipped into her palm, a black USB drive. She stared at it for several long seconds, her breath suddenly heavy. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she moved to the den and dusted off the old laptop her son used to fix for her. It groaned to life after a few minutes, and she plugged in the drive with trembling hands. Inside the folder was a single video file labeled Day 11, Fireline East. She clicked. The screen flickered. Then the face of Daniel McCarthy filled the frame. He was seated on the tailgate of a truck, sweat streaking his forehead, his uniform stained with smoke. His short blonde hair was messy, his blue eyes tired but focused. He looked directly at the camera. If you're watching this, it means Ronan made it back. I knew he would. Helen's hands flew to her mouth. Daniel continued, voice low and cautious. I can't say much. We were deployed to investigate illegal wildlife transport routes disguised as rescue operations. Someone higher up is covering it. We found cages, dozens. Ronan helped me find them. He wasn't just an animal, he was trained, he understood things. He paused, glancing behind the camera. If I disappear, it's because someone made sure of it. The video cut off. Helen sat motionless, her lungs refusing to breathe. It was no longer just grief. Now, there were questions, dread. A crack in the official story she'd been told. She printed a still image of Daniel's face and tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, then stepped back into the cold. Ronan lifted his head at her approach. She crouched beside him slowly, brushing her hand just behind his ear. It was then she noticed something odd wrapped beneath the thick fur of his neck, tucked against the muscle. Was a strip of cloth, tied like a band. Her fingers worked it free. A tag was sewn into the cloth. Property of Division 6, Wildlife Response Ops. Helen's blood ran cold. Later that evening, after Jade had gone to bed, Helen stood on the front porch, unsure who to trust. Then she remembered a name. Someone from Daniel's last letter. A field inspector from the Wildlife Bureau. He had mentioned her once, describing her as the last honest one left. Luke Hammond. She searched the old contacts file in Daniel's desk drawer and found a number. Dialed, waited. The man who answered had a voice roughened by wind and years in the field. Hammond here. Mr. Hammond, Helen said quietly. My name is Helen McCarthy. My son was Daniel McCarthy. There was a long pause. I remember him, Luke said finally. What's this about? He sent something back, Helen whispered, through a tiger. Luke arrived the next morning. He was in his early 40s, tall, with sandy brown hair that curled at the edges of his collar. He wore a forest ranger's coat patched with decades of field work, his boots covered in frost. His eyes were sharp and wary, but kind. He carried a weathered leather satchel and the air of someone who'd seen too much, but never stopped caring. He said nothing as Helen handed him the USB and the cloth band. He sat at her dining table and played the video in silence. When it ended, he leaned back, one hand rubbing the side of his stubbled jaw. Division 6 was disbanded after the fire, he muttered. Or that's what we were told. But this changes everything. Helen nodded. Ronan survived it. He carried this here. Luke looked out the window at the tiger curled near the woodshed. That's not just survival, that's a mission. They didn't see it at first, but Ronan did. He lifted his head and growled low. Helen followed his gaze to the edge of the woods, just past the tree line. A figure, too far to make out clearly, watching. By the time Luke stepped outside with binoculars, the figure was gone, but the footprints remained, fresh and deliberate. The sky over Cold Creek had shifted from gray to a brittle blue. the kind that only came after a storm had carved its name into the land. The wind had quieted, but the air still held that sharp bite of late January. Snow glistened on every branch, every rooftop, and every rusted fence post like it had been painted with silver ink. From the window, the world looked still, almost safe. Inside the house, Helen sat hunched at the dining table beside Luke Hammond. The laptop between them hummed as they scrolled through the recovered files from the USB. There were timestamps, blurry images of animal crates, handwritten maps scanned into folders, and audio logs from Daniel's field reports. None of it felt random. Daniel had documented everything. Luke leaned closer, brow furrowed. He knew he was being followed. This report mentions a shipment route near Missoula. That's over 200 miles from where he was stationed. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers trembled slightly as she hovered over another file. He said someone inside was helping cover it up, that they were using rescue missions as a front. Luke nodded, and Ronan was part of the unit, which means he saw it all. Helen glanced out the window, where Ronan was pacing slowly along the edge of the backyard. His massive paws barely disturbed the snow now. His coat, though still mottled with soot and dirt, had a quiet regality to it again. He looked like something ancient, something shaped by both man and fire. Jade had been silent that morning, quietly scribbling in her sketchbook near the fireplace. She hadn't said much since she arrived, but today there was a shift in her. Her shoulders were less hunched, her gaze more present. While Helen and Luke remained deep in files and shadows, Jade wandered outside. She didn't tell them. She didn't need to. Ronan was behind the house, near the old willow tree that had survived 2 lightning strikes and 3 winters with grace. Jade followed quietly, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Ronan paused, looked back at her, then continued to paw at the ground near the tree's exposed roots. Curious, Jade stepped closer. Ronan didn't stop her. He moved aside just slightly and let her see what he'd been digging. Something metal glinted through the disturbed snow. Jade knelt, brushing the frost away with her mittened hands until a small leather collar emerged, old, burned along the edge, but intact. She picked it up and turned it over. Toby engraved in brass. The letters were scratched, but still readable. Jade froze. She knew that name. Helen had told her once, long ago, about Toby, the dog that had worked alongside Daniel during his missions, a Belgian Malinois, trained for search and rescue. The family used to get postcards with photos of Daniel and Toby together in the field, and now the collar was here, buried in the ground behind the house. She stared at Ronan, heart thudding. "Did you bring this back?" she whispered. The tiger said nothing. Of course. But he took a slow step toward her, lowered his massive head, and gently nudged her hand with his nose. Jade's throat tightened. Her hands were shaking for a moment. She thought she might cry, but instead, something else broke through. "Thank you, Ronan," she whispered. They were the first words she had spoken aloud in months. Helen rushed outside moments later, having noticed the empty fireplace seat. She stopped cold at the sight, her granddaughter standing in the snow, holding a collar to her chest, with Ronan standing protectively beside her like a sentinel. Luke followed, his boots crunching into the icy ground. Jade turned and held up the collar. "It says, Toby," she said softly, voice fragile but clear. Helen blinked hard, her lips parted in a breathless gasp. Luke took the collar gently. Toby, he was part of Daniel's original unit. They went on every operation together. This This must have survived the fire. Helen looked at Ronan. "You dug this up for her." Ronan didn't respond, but his posture shifted subtly, shoulders straightening, eyes steady on Helen's face. Luke glanced between them. That confirms it. He's not just a survivor. He's the last witness. That night, Helen sat beside Jade's bed as the little girl traced the outline of the collar in her sketchbook, drawing Ronan beside it. "He's not scary anymore," Jade whispered sleepily. "He's like a knight." Helen smiled faintly. "Yes. Baby. A quiet one." Later, as the fire crackled in the hearth and snow fell like powdered sugar beyond the window, Ronan lay curled beside the sliding glass door. Jade's tiny coat had been folded and left atop him like a blanket. He didn't seem to mind. Luke sat at the dining table, a notepad open before him. "I'll need to contact someone I trust," he said, "if Ronan was able to recover this. Who knows what else he buried out there?" Helen nodded, but her eyes stayed on Ronan, and someone knows he's here. Someone was watching. Luke's jaw tightened. "Then we stay alert." But that night, as Helen locked the door and drew the curtains, something felt different. Not safer, no, but less lonely. Ronan didn't sleep. He lay with his back to the door, eyes open, tail resting beside the collar that now sat on the floor like a totem of the past. And when Jade stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly from a half-formed dream, he let out a low, deep breath that almost sounded like a promise. The snow had begun to melt in slow, uneven patches across Cold Creek's back roads. The pine needles glistened with thawed frost, and the heavy silence that had once blanketed the forest now gave way to a distant drip-drip from the eaves of Helen McCarthy's home. But peace was a lie that morning. Helen and Luke sat side by side in her den, maps unfolded across the table like ancient scrolls. The laptop glowed dimly nearby, the GPS coordinates Daniel had hidden in the USB blinking softly on the screen. A chill ran up Helen's spine as her eyes traced the red pins Luke had placed. "These aren't random," Luke said, his voice low. "Each one matches an abandoned ranger outpost or an old wildlife facility. All were decommissioned within months of each other, and all sat just outside protected territory lines." Helen leaned in, frowning. "You think they were used to move animals?" Luke nodded, illegally trained, hidden from oversight. If Daniel's notes are right, this wasn't just about smuggling. It was militarized animal trafficking. Someone was turning rescue centers into covert operations as they studied the map. Jade sat by the fire with a pair of scissors and a strip of ribbon. The collar, Toby's, now hung loosely in her lap. She had looped the ribbon through it carefully and was humming softly as she tied a knot. Ronan lay beside her. His great body sprawled across the wooden floor. He no longer paced. He stayed close, especially to Jade. He followed her from room to room, lay beside her bed at night, and had even begun responding subtly to her gestures. When she raised her hand, he would pause. When she spoke, his eyes always turned toward her. She reached forward now, fingers trembling slightly, and gently slipped the collar over his massive head. The ribbon nestled behind his ears like a sash, the brass nameplate catching the firelight. "There," she whispered. "Now, you're part of us." Ronan blinked slowly, then leaned forward to rest his head in her lap. The girl smiled, fingers tangling gently into the rough fur along his jaw. Helen glanced over and caught the scene. A soft ache bloomed in her chest. She didn't have long to enjoy the moment. There was a knock at the door, 3 sharp, deliberate raps. Luke stood immediately, hand on the back of his chair. Helen's heart skipped. She moved quietly to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. A man stood alone on the porch. He was in his 50s, dressed in a dark overcoat with gray slacks, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. His hair was perfectly combed, skin pale, posture military, but it was his eyes flat, unreadable. That made her stomach turn. Luke moved beside her. "Don't open it yet." But before they could stop her, Jade had already walked toward the door. Ronan rose instantly and stood between her and the entryway, his body rigid, tail low, muscles tensed. Helen quickly crossed the room and pulled Jade back. "Stay with Luke," she said gently, eyes never leaving the door. She cracked it open an inch. "Yes," she asked. The man didn't smile. "Good morning. I'm Agent Marcus Vale, Department of Strategic Animal Recovery. I believe you're housing a tiger that doesn't belong to you." Helen said nothing. Marcus adjusted his satchel. "He's marked. Asset 29L. Originally trained for reconnaissance under Division 6, he was declared missing in action after the Yellowstone fire." "His name is Ronan," Helen said coldly. "That's irrelevant." Luke stepped forward. "What's your jurisdiction here?" Agent Marcus didn't flinch. "Federal. Which means if I have to come in and retrieve the animal myself, I'm fully authorized to do so." At that moment, Ronan moved to the door. He didn't growl. He didn't roar. He simply stood in the gap of the doorframe, broad shoulders filling the entrance, eyes locked on the man with unwavering stillness. Marcus didn't take a step back, but his jaw shifted. "I see he's still responsive. That makes my job easier." Helen narrowed her eyes. "You're not taking him. You don't have a choice." But Jade's voice rose from behind them, quiet, but clear. "He's not yours." Marcus tilted his head, just enough to glimpse the girl behind the tiger's shoulder. "Children don't decide federal matters." "Little one, he didn't come back to you," Jade said. "He came home." For a long moment, the doorway was frozen in silence. Ronan stood still, tail unmoving. Then, slowly, the tiger took one step forward, placing his front paw onto the porch wood with a quiet authority that rang louder than any threat. Marcus's lips thinned. "You'll regret this," he said, voice like ice. "Close the door." "Helen," Luke murmured. "She did." Marcus didn't linger. He turned without a word and walked back down the icy steps, his black shoes crunching across gravel until the sound disappeared. Helen locked the door. Ronan turned, padding silently back toward Jade, who wrapped her arms around his neck. The collar clinked softly against his fur as she hugged him tightly. Luke exhaled. That wasn't just a warning. "No," Helen said, staring at the door. It was a threat. Later that night, Luke walked the perimeter of the property with a flashlight. He paused near the willow tree, scanning the edge of the forest. He wasn't alone. A rustle in the underbrush caught his ear. He turned. Nothing. But he felt it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. Inside the house. Jade had fallen asleep on the couch, arms curled around Ronan's torso. Helen pulled a blanket over them both. The collar still sat around Ronan's neck, proof of something deeper than ownership. Family. The morning after Agent Marcus Vale's visit arrived, not with silence, but with purpose. The air was sharp, clean, and thin, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Helen McCarthy stood on her porch, one hand wrapped around a thermos of coffee, her eyes tracing the frost-covered horizon. Ronan sat beside her, still wearing the collar Jade had fastened around his neck, the brass tag faintly glinting in the rising sun. Inside. Luke Hammond rechecked his radio frequency for the third time. The signal from the department's secure channel crackled softly but was steady. Backup was waiting on standby. A team he trusted from the old Search and Wildlife Division. Men and women who owed nothing to Marcus Vale or his silent masters. Jade was bundled up in her thick blue parka, her sketchbook tucked into the side pocket. Her eyes were wide but calm as she stood near the window, watching Ronan with a quiet trust that hadn't existed just days ago. The bond between them had deepened into something wordless. Then Ronan stood, not with fear or panic, but with certainty. He walked toward the edge of the woods without looking back. Luke stepped out. "He's leading us." Helen didn't hesitate. She called out to Jade, who nodded solemnly and followed, together. The four of them, Tiger, woman, girl, and ranger, descended into the forest. They traveled deeper than any of them had before. The snow thickened in the shadows, and the path twisted under low-hanging branches and brittle limbs. Birds were absent. Not even the wind stirred. Ronan moved with steady steps, pausing only to sniff the air or tilt his head toward some unseen memory. Eventually, he stopped. They arrived at a clearing partially hidden behind a collapsed log bridge, long forgotten by any map. At its center was a shallow mound of earth, disturbed not long ago. Ronan approached it, began digging gently with his forepaws, precise and measured. Helen crouched beside him and helped uncover the soil. Beneath it, sealed in a military-grade waterproof case, were folders, photo negatives, and a rolled canvas sleeve. Inside the sleeve were hand-marked maps, transfer orders, and 6 photos, grainy but damning, of men in uniform loading sedated animals into unmarked trucks. One figure bore a striking resemblance to Marcus Vale. Luke's hand shook as he flipped through them. These are more than just records. This is evidence, enough to expose a network. Helen's eyes welled. Daniel hid this before he died, but the moment held no time for tears. From the northern ridge of the clearing came a sharp crack, a branch snapping, fast footsteps descending. Ronan's ears flattened. Then came the voice. "Drop everything. Now." 4 figures emerged from the tree line, dressed in black tactical gear with no insignia. One man held a radio. The others carried weapons slung low, but ready. The leader was tall, late 40s, with a scar slicing from his right brow to his cheek, a man whose posture screamed control. Helen instinctively pulled Jade behind her. Luke stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This is a protected investigation. We're on file with bureau clearance. Stand down." The scarred man ignored him. "We were instructed to retrieve Asset 29L and any related material. This is your only warning." Then Ronan moved. Fast as lightning, he leapt between the group and Jade, growling low and guttural, his body a living shield. The nearest attacker raised his weapon and charged forward. Helen screamed. Jade froze. But Ronan lunged. It happened in a blur, fur, snow, a flash of movement, and the man was slammed into the ground, his weapon flying into the brush. The others shouted, scrambling. Luke drew his pistol. "Federal Wildlife Division, drop your weapons." More noise came from the trees behind them, shouts, boots and snow, then salvation. A tactical team in forest green uniforms burst through the pines, Luke's backup. At the front was a woman with salt and pepper braids and a silver badge, Sergeant Dina Cole, a former ranger with hard-set eyes and a no-nonsense stride, raised her voice. "Everyone stand down. Drop your weapons and back away from the animal within seconds." The ambush had reversed. The rogue operatives were disarmed and detained. The scarred man was forced to his knees, his radio crushed under a boot. Jade clung to Helen, shaking but unharmed. Ronan stood nearby, bleeding from a shallow gash on his side, panting hard but steady. Dina approached Luke. We intercepted a scrambled order from an off-grid base. Someone tried to erase Ronan's record entirely. He was never MIA, they listed him as eliminated. Luke's jaw clenched. They knew he carried the truth. Dina turned to Helen and nodded. He's no longer classified as property. The department has agreed unanimously. He's to be released, protected, and honored as a survivor. Helen touched Ronan's head, tears slipping freely now. He brought my son back to me, in every way that mattered. The days that followed blurred into a new rhythm. Ronan was treated at the local wildlife clinic by Dr. Anya Reed, a quiet, observant veterinarian in her late 30s with curly black hair and thick glasses. She moved with grace and spoke with a warm firmness. "He's strong," she said after the first examination. "Whatever he's been through, he still trusts people. That's rare, that's remarkable." The evidence Ronan had protected was submitted to federal review. A full investigation was launched. Marcus Vale disappeared before questioning, his last known location somewhere in Alaska. The operatives who attacked the group were arrested and charged. And Ronan, he stayed. Helen, Luke, and Jade, together with Dina and Anya, opened a small wildlife rehabilitation center on the edge of Cold Creek, built from a converted ranger station near the base of the ridge. They named it Ronan's Refuge. It became a place not only for injured animals, but for wounded people too. Veterans, children with anxiety, women seeking silence and safety. Jade led the first art therapy program, sketching alongside rescued foxes and owls. Luke ran education workshops. Helen tended the medical hut, and Ronan. He roamed the grounds like a gentle king, watchful, calm, present. Some mornings, he would lie by the front gate and wait for visitors. Other times, he rested beneath the willow tree out back, the brass tag on his collar clicking faintly in the breeze. On the first anniversary of the refuge's opening, the sun poured across the snow-dappled mountain in long golden ribbons. Laughter echoed through the woods, and Jade, now braver and bolder, handed Ronan a painted stone with Daniel's name on it. He sniffed it once, then sat beside her without a sound. No one spoke, because they didn't need to. The roar had already been heard. Sometimes, the loudest miracles don't come with trumpets or thunder. They come quietly, in the form of a scarred tiger who refuses to forget, a little girl who finds her voice, or a mother who learns that love never dies, even when it walks on 4 legs. Ronan didn't just carry evidence, he carried faith. Faith that truth survives fire, that healing can begin in the most broken places, that God sends help not always as angels with wings, but sometimes as tigers with kind eyes and brave hearts. In life, we all face our own storms, loss, silence, betrayal. But just like Ronan returned with Daniel's final message, sometimes hope returns to us in unexpected ways. We just have to open the door. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below your thoughts, or just write Amen if you believe that no act of love, no roar of truth, ever goes unheard by God. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one, and may God bless and protect each of you and your loved ones.